On a humid morning in Ouagadougou, military trucks stop abruptly in the city center. Cameras turn. President Ibrahim Traoré steps out in uniform not to speak, but to grab a shovel. His ministers follow. The street cleaners freeze in disbelief. Then slowly, they hand over gloves, boots, and brooms. A stunned silence grips the nation. A general has just joined the janitors. What began as a symbolic gesture was about to erupt into a nationwide transformation, one that no one, especially the elite, could have predicted. Stay tuned as this gripping story unfolds into one of Burkina Faso's most emotional, powerful, and unexpected revolutions of dignity and unity. The moment President Traoré's boots touched the dirt, the city paused. A woman selling mangoes near the traffic light gasped, her hands trembling as fruit dropped from her basket. A street cleaner named Mariam stared unblinking as the president rolled up his sleeves. This was no press stunt. His face was serious, his eyes locked on the trash heap beneath a flowering neem tree. One by one, his ministers arrived, ditching air-conditioned SUVs and dress shoes for gloves and orange vests. Some stumbled awkwardly as they bent down, unused to the weight of a broom or the stink of rotting garbage. But no one turned back. A few minutes later, Mariam moved. She passed her extra gloves to the defense minister, her hands calloused and worn, steady as stone. Around them, silence turned to murmurs. Murmurs became movement. Vendors stopped selling. Children stopped playing. Elders stood in doorways. Across Ouagadougou, word spread like wildfire. The president is sweeping the streets. At a nearby corner, traffic halted. A taxi driver turned off his engine and joined in, grabbing a rake from the back of his cab. No one honked. No one complained. Something far bigger than a cleanup had begun. By noon, 1,000 hands were working. Plastic mud-broken glass, all scraped, sorted, lifted. In the heat, ministers sweated through their collars. Journalists tried to catch close-ups, but Traoré waved them off. "This is not for the cameras," he said. "It's for the country." That statement would loop on national radio within the hour, igniting debates in homes, cafes, and offices. Was this humility or politics, sincerity or strategy? Only one thing was certain: no one could look away. Later that afternoon, a small confrontation sparked at the intersection of Avenue Kwame Nkrumah. A suited man in dark sunglasses, a wealthy contractor, yelled at a group blocking his way. "Move! This is ridiculous. Where are the police?" A soldier cleaning a gutter stood up. "We are the police today." The man scoffed. "You're cleaning sewers with the president like it's a school play." The soldier stepped aside. "Grab a bucket, or grab your silence." The man hesitated, then under dozens of watchful eyes took the bucket. The tension cracked. A roar of applause rose. From rooftops and balconies, people began cheering, some weeping. Not because of trash being cleared, but because for the first time, everyone mattered equally. That night, national television didn't air dramas or football. Instead, it played a simple loop images of ministers lifting bins, Traoré wiping sweat from his brow, and children dancing around piles of clean earth. In the presidential palace, lights stayed on late. Advisors reviewed the footage, anxious. "Sir, this is escalating. The people are emotional." The opposition Traoré raised a hand. "Let them feel. Let them remember what government looks like." Outside the gates, sanitation workers were being served fresh meals. The kitchen staff, by their own choice, had brought out tables and chairs. A cook whispered, "They feed us every day. Today we feed them." Meanwhile, in rural towns, WhatsApp groups exploded. Photos of the cleanup spread beyond borders. In Mali, Niger, Ghana, messages flooded in. "We see you. We are next." One comment read, "He doesn't just clean streets, he's cleaning leadership." At midnight, a radio host in Bobo Dioulasso played an old revolutionary song, mixing it with audio from the cleanup. It went viral by dawn. The chorus once used in liberation movements now had new meaning. "Sweep the dust plant, the roots walk the path together." A grandmother called in, crying, "I never thought I'd live to see a president who bends." By the next morning, something irreversible had begun. Brooms were being sold out in markets. Children drew pictures of politicians holding mops. One teacher replaced the day's math lesson with a trip outside to clean the school gate. "Math can wait," she said, "but dignity cannot." And deep in the heart of the capital, behind a newly cleaned public fountain, a little girl stood barefoot, holding a trash bag almost too big for her. When a reporter asked her name, she smiled. "Aicha. I clean because my president does. And if he can do it, then maybe we all can." The reporter lowered her mic, speechless. The camera kept rolling. Every morning, Aicha left the house before the sun rose. Her school uniform, carefully ironed by her mother the night before, always managed to pick up dust the moment she stepped outside. The path to school wound through broken sidewalks and trash heaps, where plastic bottles crunched beneath her sandals and the stench of rotting food clung to the air. She never complained. Her mother had taught her that complaints never cleaned streets. Only hands did. And her mother's hands, scarred, cracked, calloused, worked 6 days a week for less than what some men spent on lunch. On this particular morning, Aicha's eyes stung, not from the dust, but from what she had seen on the news the night before. Her mother was on TV, though she hadn't said anything about it. The clip was short, but unforgettable. There she was, handing gloves to the president himself. President Traoré, standing in the dirt, bowing slightly to her mother, before grabbing a shovel. At first, Aicha thought it was a dream, but when she asked her mother, just smiled and said, "Even powerful men must wash their hands with water from the same well." That was all. No further explanation. No boast. Just a quiet dignity that lived in her mother's bones. That morning, the city buzzed with confusion. Vendors asked each other if the president would come back. Radio hosts debated whether yesterday was history or just theater. But Aicha didn't care about the arguments. She cared about what she saw with her own eyes. When she reached the roundabout near the central market, she stopped cold. A military truck had returned. People gathered on the sidewalks, whispering, pointing. There he was again, President Traoré, this time, in a plain vest, broom in hand, already sweeping. No cameras, no speeches, just movement. Behind him, ministers followed like shadows, cleaning silently. But what caught Aicha's breath wasn't the president. It was the figure beside him, her mother, still wearing the same green uniform with the reflective yellow stripe. Still working. But this time not invisible. Aicha dropped her school bag right there on the ground. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She pushed past the crowd, ran to the curb, and grabbed a broken rake someone had left behind. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for a nod. She just started scraping trash into a pile right next to them. Her mother saw her, and for a second, froze. A faint panic flickered in her eyes. School was important. But then she saw the determination in Aicha's face. and said nothing, just nodded once proud and quiet. Traoré noticed her too. He paused, resting on the handle of his broom, and smiled gently. "What's your name?" he asked. "Aisha," she said, still working. "Why are you here, Aisha?" "Because this street leads to my school," she replied, "and I want it to be clean when I walk it." The president said nothing else. He simply handed her a pair of gloves from his own pocket. Adult size. Too big. But she slipped them on anyway. Later that day at school, Aisha arrived late and covered in grime. Her teacher frowned. "Where have you been?" "I was with my mother," she said. "And the president." The class erupted in whispers. The teacher raised an eyebrow. Doing what cleaning Aisha said proudly. "Because if they can touch the trash, so can I." The room fell silent. And the teacher, a man known for his strictness, quietly removed his chalk from the board and said, "Then today, we'll learn about service, not science." By evening, Aisha's story had traveled. A passerby had snapped a photo, her tiny figure, in oversized gloves beside a president knee-deep in trash. It flooded social media. People called her the broom girl, the daughter of dignity, the spark of the streets. But to Aisha, it wasn't about fame. It was about finally seeing her mother, truly seeing her standing tall beside the most powerful man in the country, not as a servant, but as an equal. Back at home, as her mother rinsed her hands under the outdoor tap, Aisha watched closely. Water ran brown, then clear. "Did you ever think this day would come?" Aisha asked. Her mother didn't answer right away. She dried her hands on her skirt and looked at her daughter. "The streets weep because no one listens to them," she said softly. "But today someone heard. And tomorrow someone like you will answer louder." That night, Aisha wrote a single sentence in her school notebook underneath her spelling exercises. "If our leaders don't touch our pain, how can they clean it?" She didn't show it to anyone. But deep inside, she knew. This wasn't just about trash. It was about worth. About being seen. About what rises when even the smallest hands are allowed to hold something sacred. The sun had barely pushed through the clouds when Minister Seydou Konaté, head of the Ministry of Education, arrived at the cleanup site wearing freshly polished loafers and a crisp white shirt. He had insisted on joining the campaign personally, despite objections from his staff. "The president is in the mud. I won't be the one watching from the balcony," he had said firmly that morning. But now standing knee-deep in sludge near an open gutter in Sector 15, he was regretting the shoes. The smell was overwhelming, a sour mix of rot and stagnant water. Children played nearby, barefoot, dodging piles of plastic. Beside him, sanitation workers moved with practiced ease, their rhythm steady, their faces calm. Seydou tried to keep up, grabbing a large sack of collected debris. It was heavier than it looked. He took 2 unsteady steps backward, tried to shift his grip, and slipped. The fall was spectacular. His body hit the mud with a wet thud, the bag bursting beside him, spilling wrappers, old cloth, even a rusted tin can. For a second, everything stopped. Then someone laughed. Then another, and then the entire block burst into laughter, not mocking, but surprised, even joyful. Children squealed, pointing. A woman shouted, "He fell like one of us." Seydou didn't move at first. The mud was cold and thick on his back. His hands trembling were now indistinguishable from the ground. Then slowly he sat up, looked around, and began to laugh too. His laughter was loud, open, honest. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, now streaked in brown, and stood up. The crowd clapped. He raised both arms in surrender. "This," he said, voice cracking with amusement, "is the curriculum we never had. People cheered. But the smile faded briefly from his face as he looked down at his hands. For the first time, he truly noticed the filth, not just on his skin, but in the system he had helped shape. He remembered walking through pristine government halls, drafting policies from behind a mahogany desk. He remembered clean boardrooms, filtered air PowerPoint presentations about youth engagement and community outreach. Yet here on the same streets, his ministry claimed to serve children were playing in garbage. Schools were next to open sewers. A small boy tugged at his pant leg. "Monsieur Ministre, do you want to ride in the cart?" he asked, pointing to a metal cleanup cart filled with leaves and wood. Seydou laughed again. "You want to push me?" The boy nodded proudly. Instead, Seydou bent down, scooped him up with strong arms, and placed him gently in the cart. "No," he said. "Today you ride. And I push." The boy beamed. The crowd clapped again, this time slower, deeper. Some began to chant his name. By midday, Seydou was still at it. His white shirt was brown. His loafers were abandoned. A woman had handed him old rubber boots, which he wore without complaint. He shoveled debris, cleared weeds, and asked questions, real ones. How long has this drain been blocked? Does the school nearby have clean water? Do the kids here get textbooks? The answers stung. No one had ever come to ask. Not a mayor, not a deputy, certainly not a minister. A young girl approached him, holding a tattered workbook. "This is from school. It got wet because the classroom leaks." He took it carefully, flipping through the warped pages. Raindrops had blurred the ink. A crude drawing of a flag had bled into the math problems beneath it. "May I keep this?" he asked. She nodded. "It's ruined anyway." "No," he said gently. "It's a reminder." That evening he returned to his office without changing. Mud still clung to his sleeves. His secretary stared confused. "Call a meeting," he said immediately. "Tonight." "Sir, it's Sunday," she replied. "Exactly," he said, walking past her. "The country works 7 days a week. So will we." At the emergency session, his staff squirmed uncomfortably at his appearance. Some covered their noses. But Seydou ignored the stares. "We're revising the education budget," he announced. "Effective immediately, every school near a sanitation zone will receive emergency maintenance funds. We'll prioritize roofs, water access, and new materials. But that's not part of the quarterly plan," someone began. He cut them off. Neither was falling into the gutter. "But here we are." They went silent. Later that night, alone in his office, Seydou placed the ruined workbook on his desk beside a framed family photo. He stared at it a long time. Then opened a drawer, took out his own childhood notebook from decades ago, and placed the two side by side. Same lines, same margins, but a world of difference between them. He whispered to himself, "We've taught theory long enough. It's time we teach presence." Outside, the streets were still echoing with Broom's laughter, and something deeper, something like a lesson finally learned. The orange vests came by the hundreds. Folded in neat piles, they were handed out without title, without question. No names were stitched onto them. No distinctions made between ministry, military, or marketplace. Just a bright strip across the chest and back, a signal that today everyone served the same master, the earth beneath their feet. Colonel Umaru Diallo hadn't worn anything without his insignia in 23 years. The medals, the pressed khaki, the polished boots, they had shaped his identity, carved his presence into the silence of rooms. But this morning, standing in the middle of Rue de la Solidarité, his hands reached for the same vest offered to a student behind him. The fabric was light, but the meaning was heavy. He slipped it on, and with it the weight of hierarchy fell away. To his left stood Adissa, a tomato vendor who'd worked that corner of the street since before the colonel enlisted. Her skirt was frayed, her sandals mismatched, but her grip on the broom was unshakable. She had already filled 3 bags of debris before he arrived. When he greeted her, she looked up confused. "Your army?" she asked. He nodded. "You've never greeted me before." "I never saw you before," he said quietly. She stared at him for a long second, then handed him a brush. "Then let's make today different." Side by side, they crouched beside a storm drain, long choked with trash and plastic. The sun was already high, and sweat dripped into their eyes. A teenager passed them a jug of water which they shared without words. Across the boulevard, high schoolers in neon gloves were sweeping near parked buses. A police officer worked beside a retired teacher. Mothers formed teams with civil servants. Bankers followed the lead of street cleaners. And everywhere you looked, those vests, orange, plain, equalizing, moved in rhythm. A journalist tried to interview a young soldier working under a tree. "Why are you here, instead of guarding the perimeter?" The soldier wiped his brow and pointed to the shovel in his hand. "Because today rank means nothing. Only the land matters." Further down the street, a disagreement broke out. A man in a tailored blazer complained that his vest was too dirty. "I need a clean one," he demanded. "This one smells." A sanitation worker named Eli looked him dead in the eyes. "It smells like my life," he said. "If you can't wear it, you shouldn't have come." The man hesitated, then slowly pulled it over his shoulders. Traoré arrived just in time to witness it. He said nothing, just nodded at Ely, whose face didn't change. Respect had been earned, not assigned. Later, in a narrow alley behind the municipal library, an unusual image stopped time. A judge, robes folded and replaced with an orange vest, was scrubbing graffiti from a wall with a student who had been arrested the previous year for vandalism. They didn't speak of the past. They simply cleaned. Nearby, 2 women carried bundles of collected trash up a steep hill. One wore the traditional head wrap of a rural matriarch, the other a sleek braid under a city cap. They matched each other's pace, laughing like sisters. In a public square, a blind man ran his hands along the arm of a statue to identify it. A child gently placed a vest over his shoulders and said, "You don't need to see to serve." The man smiled, raised his broom, and followed the sound of voices. As the afternoon wore on, a group of elderly veterans gathered near the city park. Most walked with canes. One had a wooden leg. Without being asked, they began clearing brush and pulling weeds. When a bystander tried to stop them, worried they might collapse. One of the veterans replied, "We didn't fall when bullets flew. We won't fall for leaves." Someone started clapping. Then others joined. And soon every vest-wearing hand in the park applauded them not for bravery in war, but for courage in peace. The orange vests blurred every line, between rich and poor, between urban and rural, between official and forgotten. People who had passed each other for years now spoke, laughed, and worked together. No one led with their title. They led with their hands. In the late hours, as shadows stretched across the city, a photo circulated on social media. It showed a police commander lifting a wheelbarrow as 2 young girls, perhaps 8 or 9, filled it with trash. The caption read, "She taught him where to stand." By nightfall, the city had changed not just in cleanliness, but in spirit. The orange vests hung on doorways and fences drying in the breeze, but their message lingered in the air. In homes and corners and quiet alleys, people whispered, I worked with someone today I never thought I'd speak to. Others simply said today felt like how a country should. And high above it all, the drone of streetlights hummed gently over roads that for the first time in years no longer carried just dust, but dignity. Not everyone was clapping. High above Ouagadougou's cleaned streets, in a glass-tinted corner office of the Zind Capitol building, Alain Nikiema adjusted his tie and slammed his phone on the desk. He had just finished a heated call with one of the board members. "Do they expect us to endorse this nonsense?" he snapped. Sweeping streets. Ministers in the mud. It's a circus. Investors are watching, and what do they see? A president with a broom and a country too busy cleaning to work. Alain was CEO of one of Burkina Faso's largest logistics firms. His company moved goods, managed contracts, and advised regional partners. To him, optics mattered, schedules mattered. And this campaign, though stirring hearts, was disrupting everything. The private sector drives GDP, he muttered to himself. Not mop parades. At a late dinner that night with fellow executives, he made his opinion public. Cameras rolled as he leaned back confidently in a black suit. "This cleanup campaign," he said, "is an emotional distraction. We need productivity, not publicity. If the president wants results, he should pick up a briefcase, not a broom." The clip aired on national TV within the hour. By midnight, it was viral. The next morning, Alain arrived at his office building and froze. Dozens of brooms, used old some, cracked others, brand new, stood upright, neatly lined across the steps of his front entrance. They stretched in a silent formation from the sidewalk to the revolving glass doors. A few had handwritten notes tied to them. One read, "This cleaned my grandmother's street." Another, "My son uses this so he doesn't miss school when it rains." None of them were angry, just present. Security guards looked uneasy. Employees stepped around them without speaking. No one removed the brooms. They simply stood still, quiet, insistent. Inside, Alain's mood was sour. "This is theater," he growled. "Where is the respect for institutions?" But just before noon, something happened that no one expected. The elevator pinged. The doors opened, and President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out alone. No guards, no press, just him wearing boots and carrying a mop. Alain stood up abruptly. "Mr. President." "What is this?" Traoré didn't raise his voice. He placed the mop gently against the glass conference table and looked Alain directly in the eyes. "You said a briefcase changes a nation," he said. "But tell me, when was the last time a briefcase kept a child from stepping in sewage?" Alain's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, sir, your campaign slows economic output. Markets need momentum, not emotion." Traoré moved toward the window. Below them, the city stretched wide rooftops, shining streets cleaner than they had been in years. "Alain," he said softly, "you move goods, I move people. Which one builds a nation?" Alain didn't answer. "I came with a mop," Traoré continued, "because I don't need a speech. I need you to feel what your country feels. These brooms outside, they're not accusations. They're invitations." Alain's voice cracked slightly. "You came here to shame me." "No," Traoré said. "I came to ask if you're willing to stand on the ground that built your towers." Silence fell. Then quietly, Alain walked over, picked up the mop, and gripped it awkwardly. His tailored suit looked out of place, his polished shoes already picking up specks of dust. "I don't know how to use this," he admitted. "Neither did I," said Traoré. "But the people taught me." The next day, Alain was seen sweeping the entrance of his own building surrounded by staff. They wore vests. They carried buckets. No cameras had been invited, but someone filmed anyway. The clip showed Alain laughing as a sanitation worker showed him how to scrape gum off concrete. A man walked by and called out, "That your productivity, boss?" Alain didn't flinch. He raised the broom and smiled. "Best return on investment I've had all year." By afternoon, companies across the city followed suit. Construction firms sent teams to clean sites they hadn't maintained in years. Bank managers swept sidewalks before unlocking their doors. Even luxury boutiques posted signs that read, "We clean where we profit." The symbolism wasn't lost. It wasn't about pretending to be poor. It was about proving you were part of the same soil. Later that week, Traoré gave a rare evening address. Not from the palace, not from behind a podium, but standing in a small alley behind a local school holding a child's broom. In a nation where even the wealthy bend to pick up what the poor must live with, he said, "You don't just create order, you create belonging." No applause, just quiet respect. And far above the city, back in his glass office, Alain placed the mop against his wall next to his first company award. He stared at it for a long time. Then he turned off the lights and left through the front door, stepping over no brooms at all. The morning sun clung low to the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty lot behind the market in Bisighin. Rows of women bent over their brooms, sweeping in unison, their hands moving with the rhythm of tradition. One woman older than most, her gray head wrap soaked with sweat, suddenly stopped, straightened her back, and began to hum. It was faint at first, just a soft, steady tune. Then her voice rose above the scrape of brooms on sand. It was an old song, one the women hadn't heard in years, not since their mothers sang it during the drought when they walked miles to fetch water with babies tied to their backs. It was a resistance song, not against soldiers, but against hunger, silence, and shame. The humming turned into words. The words gained power. Then, like a wave, the women around her joined in. "Sweep, sweep, child of the soil, the land hears you before it sees you." Brooms tapped in rhythm. Hips swayed gently. Voices layered, some sharp and strong, others low and cracked by time. What began as labor became liturgy. Men nearby paused. They had been loading trash into carts, but now one of them tapped a plastic bucket. Another added rhythm with the side of a metal pan. Within minutes, the women's chorus had drums under it. Not real drums, but pots, crates, and bare hands on old wood. And somehow it was perfect. Children clapped and skipped between the adults. One little boy picked up a broken lid and danced like he'd done it his whole life. A toddler laughed so hard, she dropped her broom and started spinning dizzy from joy. In the middle of it all, Minister Seydou Konaté reappeared. This time not in a white shirt, but in a simple green tunic already marked by mud. He stopped at the edge of the circle, listening. A sanitation worker he'd met days ago handed him a jerry can to tap like a drum. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled and joined in. A griot, the village oral historian, stood a few feet back, wrapped in a faded blue robe, leaning on a cane. His eyes were heavy with memory. A young journalist noticed him and turned a handheld camera toward his face. "What do you see today, Elder?" she asked. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the singing crowd. "They called us dirty," he said softly, almost like a prayer. "Now we're purifying ourselves." He turned to the camera. "This isn't a cleanup. It's a ceremony. By late morning, similar scenes bloomed across the city. Everywhere the orange vests went. Songs followed. Not just the old ones, but new verses made on the spot. Street vendors sang about their stalls, students about their schools. Sanitation workers added lines about gloves and garbage, their voices laced with pride. In a small courtyard near a clinic, a group of midwives created a call and response chant. Who catches the child? We do. Who cleans the floor? We do. Who keeps the future breathing? We do. Doctors joined in laughing, their coats smeared with dust. Even the patients waiting outside hummed along. Later that afternoon, a truck filled with drums pulled up outside the National Library. Traoré had sent it quietly without announcement. Not to perform, but to equip the movement. A sign on the side read, "For the music beneath the labor." Musicians distributed the instruments to whoever wanted them. Old men, giggling girls, a pregnant woman who tapped a gentle rhythm against her belly. Suddenly, every cleanup zone was alive with rhythm. But it wasn't chaos. It was coordinated like the beating of a national heart, rediscovering its pulse. Some of the foreign journalists didn't know what to make of it. They came expecting poverty dysfunction, maybe a feel-good moment. What they witnessed was something different, an uprising not of protest, but of pride. That evening, under a mango tree in a quiet neighborhood, a grandmother lit incense beside a pile of swept leaves. She didn't say a word, just closed her eyes, nodded to the sky, and let the smoke rise. Nearby, her grandson filmed her on his phone and whispered, "She says this reminds her of when independence first came." The video would reach 500,000 views in 2 days. Meanwhile, the griot continued moving from block to block, singing back the verses he heard, weaving stories from one corner of the city to the next. In his mind, the brooms had become instruments, the dust a canvas, and the people finally were writing their own anthem. That night, as dusk fell, Traoré walked quietly along a freshly cleaned street. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply stopped to listen. Somewhere in the distance, a group was still singing. Faint, steady, alive. He turned to one of his advisors and said, "You hear that?" The advisor nodded. "Yes, sir." "The cleanup." No, Traoré replied. The country remembering its own voice. The first raindrops fell softly, almost playfully, as if unsure of their place in the celebration. Children looked up, giggling, letting the cool droplets dance on their cheeks. A few even cheered. But within minutes, the rhythm changed. The playful taps turned into pounding sheets. The sky opened wide over Ouagadougou, and with it came something no one had prepared for. At the market near Tanghin, water rushed through the alleyways like wild snakes. Trash bags, once carefully piled, broke open. Rotting vegetables used plastic bits of cloth, all tumbled into the streets in a foul, muddy current. Drains that had been half cleared filled up too quickly. A broom floated past a woman's foot, and she stared at it in disbelief. She had spent the whole morning cleaning that very spot. Screams erupted as the water surged over a low curb and flooded a row of vendor stalls. Some women tried to salvage their goods. Others simply watched as their work dissolved into a gray-brown river. The music stopped. The dancing stopped. Only the roar of rain and the chaos of broken effort remained. On a narrow street nearby, a sanitation worker named Aminata dropped to her knees, sobbing. Her arms hung limp at her sides. Her hands, red from scrubbing, trembled. "I swept for hours," she cried. "I swept, I scrubbed, I planted flowers. And look, She pointed as the water dragged away a pile of compost she had spent the morning building. Even heaven cannot clean what we've ignored for years. People around her stood silent. There was no comfort to offer, no slogan to chant. Just the cold, humiliating sound of garbage washing over bare feet. A young student threw down his broom in frustration. "Why did we even try?" he shouted. "The dirt always wins." It was in that moment that President Traoré arrived. No motorcade, just him, a rain-soaked cap shielding his eyes. His vest clung to his chest. His boots splashed through the rising puddles as he walked directly to Aminata and knelt beside her. Without hesitation, he picked up a piece of dripping cloth and placed it back in the compost pile. He didn't speak right away. He let the water run over them both. Then, in a voice that barely rose above the rain, he said, "We clean anyway. We clean until the sky joins us." Aminata looked up at him confused. Her tears mixed with the rain. "But it's washing it all away." He nodded. "It's showing us what's buried deeper, not just plastic, but decisions, neglect, decay, things we hid for years behind speeches and numbers." He stood slowly and turned to the crowd. "We thought a broom was enough, but now the land is speaking louder, and we will listen." That night, emergency cleanup efforts began not led by the government, but by the people. Volunteers showed up with sandbags digging trenches to redirect the floodwater. Mechanics pulled apart clogged drainage pipes. Students formed human chains to lift overturned bins and gather soaked waste. The rain didn't stop, but neither did they. In neighborhoods that had long been forgotten by the city's budget, something powerful stirred. Elders who had stopped believing in change suddenly showed up with old mops and towels. One man tied a plastic sheet over a tree branch and declared it the citizens' tent, offering warm tea to the exhausted. Traoré stayed on the ground through the night. He worked beside everyone else, his hands blistered and his shoulders stiff. No cameras were present, but word spread quickly. Photos emerged online of him barefoot, scooping trash from a flooded school hallway. One caption read, "He didn't wait for the rain to pass." He stepped into the storm. In the early morning light, the rain eased. The sky turned pale. Streets shimmered with wetness but began to dry. What remained was astonishing. Not just the mud and debris, but the sight of strangers leaning on each other, of families helping neighbors who didn't speak the same dialect, of students sweeping not for praise, but because the city had become theirs again. At the heart of it all stood a wall once covered in grime, now clean. Someone had chalked a single sentence across it in bold white strokes. "If the rain cannot wash it, then we must." Later that day, Traoré stood before a crowd of workers at the edge of a flooded canal. His voice cracked as he spoke. "This is not a failure," he said. "This is truth." The rain didn't undo our work. It revealed the work still to be done. A woman in the crowd raised her hand. "Will you help us rebuild the sewers?" He answered without pause. "Not rebuild. Rethink. We built for profit, not people. That ends now." That week, a new task force was formed, not of officials, but of engineers, architects, and everyday citizens with first-hand knowledge of the land. Their goal was simple design drainage that respects the rhythm of rain and the dignity of those who live by its mercy. For years, the rain had been a destroyer, a reminder of broken systems and false promises. But now the people had answered it not with fear, but with grit. And as the clouds cleared, the scent that lingered was not just mud. It was change. It was memory. It was the start of cleaning not just streets, but history. She had never met a president. In fact, Maimuna Sankara had never met a mayor, never been invited to a government building, never had her name printed in a newspaper. For 30 years, she swept the same 4 streets in Sector 11. Her days began before the sun and ended when the flies quieted. She wore the same green uniform, the same rubber gloves patched 3 times with needle and thread. She walked with a slight limp from an old injury never treated. No one noticed. Until now. On the 8th day of the campaign, President Traoré arrived quietly on her block. His boots were scuffed from the flood. His hands still carried the scent of wet clay. He didn't bring a speech, just a bucket and a question. "Where do we begin here?" The local coordinator pointed. "She'll show you." Maimuna looked up from her wheelbarrow. She squinted against the sun. Her fingers, wrapped in those old gloves, never paused from picking up the trash scattered by the recent rain. The president waited. When she finally rose, her knees cracked. She placed the broom in the cart and looked him dead in the eye. "I've been cleaning this corner since your father was a soldier," she said. "You ready to sweat or just smile for the cameras?" Traoré chuckled softly. "I left the cameras behind." She nodded once. "Then follow me." They worked side by side in silence. She didn't offer conversation. He didn't force any. She showed him where the drain needed unclogging. He knelt and used his bare hands. She pointed out the cracks in the sidewalk. He took notes. After an hour, she finally leaned against her broom and looked at him again. "You've got strong hands," she said. "Yours are stronger," he replied. She laughed bitterly. "My hands have been in filth for 30 years. No one ever thanked me. Not once." He paused, looked down at her gloves, cracked, stained, faded to a pale gray. He reached out his hand. She stared at it, unsure. "I can't shake with gloves on," she said quietly. "Then take them off," he said. She did. Slowly, carefully, she peeled the gloves from her fingers. Her hands were dark, and wrinkled nails, chipped scars, crisscrossed her palms, like stories never written down. She reached out. Their hands met. The crowd that had begun to gather went still. Traoré didn't let go. He bowed his head as he held her hand in both of his. "Then today," he said, "a nation thanks you." Maimuna's lip trembled. For a moment she tried to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she placed her other hand over his and held it there. The silence spoke louder than any anthem. Someone nearby began to cry. Another picked up a broom and held it upright like a flag. That image, a president bowing to a sanitation worker, her glove hanging from her belt, their hands intertwined, spread across the country within hours. Newspapers ran it on the front page. Radio hosts described it as a holy moment. Social media flooded with captions like, "Real service wears no crown," and "Dignity begins in the dirt." But Maimuna wasn't seeking fame. The next day, she was back on her route, sweeping as usual, her gloves repaired with a new patch stitched in red thread. When a local journalist asked her why she hadn't taken the day off, she replied, "He thanked me, not replaced me. The work is still mine." That same afternoon, the Ministry of Labor announced the creation of a National Registry of Civic Service, recognizing sanitation workers, street cleaners, waste collectors, and janitors as official agents of the state. Each worker would receive identification, a benefits package, and most importantly, a name in the records of public service. In honor of Maimuna, the policy was named Decree of the Hands. The next week, in every major city, similar moments unfolded. In Bobo Dioulasso, a boy gave his grandmother's gloves to a minister with the words, "She cleaned your school before you were born." In Kudugu, sanitation workers were invited to lead a parade walking in front instead of sweeping behind. One evening, Maimuna's daughter visited from the countryside. She brought her own son, a quiet boy with shy eyes. He stared at the framed photo of his grandmother, shaking the president's hand now hanging above the stove. "Is it true?" he asked. "Did he really come to you?" She smiled. "He didn't come to me. He came to where the truth was." Later that night, as the boy fell asleep on her lap, Maimuna looked out the window. The streets were cleaner now. Not perfect, not healed. But something had shifted. She whispered to the wind, "I was never invisible. The world just took too long to look down." And from that window, the city stretched in quiet dignity, gloves drying on lines, brooms resting upright, and hands calloused and proud, still holding the nation together. The people of Komsilga had always called him the boy mayor. At 32, Jibril Ouedraogo was the youngest municipal leader in the country. When he took office 2 years earlier, the whispers were loud. Too young, too soft, too emotional. He'd campaigned on ideas: free public Wi-Fi community gardens, flood-proof walkways. His critics scoffed. "Dreams don't unclog sewers," one rival said. But Jibril remembered what clogged sewers had cost him. When the national cleanup campaign reached his district, he didn't wait for an invitation. He gathered his entire staff, administrators, secretaries, drivers, and showed up in orange vests before sunrise. No press, no announcement, just boots, gloves, and a promise to make good on the words he once whispered at his brother's grave. He started in Zone 3, near the old school, where he and his brother Bakar once played soccer after class. The smell hit him before he reached the alley. A sour mix of damp trash urine and old cooking oil. He didn't flinch. He walked straight into the narrow path and began lifting garbage into a rusted cart. His staff hesitated, standing back in silence. Then Jibril turned to them. "If I can clean here, so can you, because this is where my family broke." A few meters away stood an old metal gate, once blue, now rusted black. Behind it lived an elderly woman who opened her door slowly, clutching a broom. She recognized him immediately. "Jibril," she said. He nodded. "Yes, Mama Adama." She stepped forward, tears already forming. "I remember the day we buried Bakar. You were just a boy. You clung to your mother's skirt and didn't speak for days." Jibril swallowed hard. "I'm still not done speaking. That's why I'm here." His brother had been 13 when the cholera outbreak hit. The rains had overwhelmed the drains, and the standing water behind their house had turned foul. No one came to clean it. No one listened when his mother pleaded for help. The infection spread fast. The nearest clinic had no medicine. By the time they reached the hospital, it was too late. Jibril never forgot. Not the silence in the car. Not his father's scream outside the ward. Not the plastic bag they were handed, filled with his brother's last belongings, a wet shirt, a toy watch, and a folded note that read, "Don't forget me." He never did. That morning, as he bent to scoop muck from the drain, his staff joined him. One by one, they stepped into the sludge. The city clerk used a rake. The finance officer lifted a mattress that had clogged the flow. Even the janitor from City Hall, usually quiet and reserved, found himself leading a team of students through a side street. Jibril worked without pause. A reporter arrived mid-morning and asked him why he hadn't called for media coverage. He didn't stop moving. Because grief doesn't need an audience, he said. Only action. The reporter followed him for blocks, capturing images of a mayor with sleeves rolled and sweat pouring. At one point, Jibril turned to the camera and said, "I won't bury another citizen because we were too proud to bend and sweep." The image went viral. It reached every district, every town hall. Suddenly, other young leaders once mocked for being too grassroots stepped forward. In Bagre, a councilwoman organized night cleanups for shift workers. In Rio, a district chief turned his birthday celebration into a city-wide cleaning festival. The movement had grown roots. But back in Komsilga, Jibril didn't pause for praise. That afternoon, he visited the cemetery. He brought flowers not bought, but picked from the roadside. He cleaned the plaque on Bakar's grave with a wet cloth, then sat beside it in silence. "I brought gloves," he whispered. "And people who finally understand why dirt matters." A child walked by and recognized him. The boy waved, then hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. Jibril smiled and beckoned him over. "Do you know what this place is?" he asked. The boy nodded. "It's where the heroes sleep." Jibril looked back at the grave. "Sometimes, but also where the forgotten wait." The boy tilted his head. "Will you remember them?" Jibril nodded. "That's why I'm mayor." That night his team gathered in the municipal courtyard. The power had gone out, but no one left. They lit candles and shared tea brewed over a small fire. No one talked politics. No one brought documents. They shared stories of their neighborhoods, of the people they lost, of the families they failed. For the first time, governance felt like kinship. Someone asked Jibril what tomorrow's route would be. He pointed toward the industrial zone, the dirtiest sector in the city. "People think cleaning is beneath leadership," he said. "But maybe that's where leadership begins." And so they planned not with budgets and whiteboards, but with flashlights, gloves, and old maps marked by memory. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet soil and something deeper, something like a second chance. And beneath that same sky, near a cleaned drain that once killed his brother Jibril, stood with hands calloused, heart open, and a broom leaning on his shoulder like a badge no election could give. They came with fury in their voices and dust in their throats. About 200 of them marched down Avenue de la Liberté, clutching handwritten signs, their shoes slapping hard against the pavement. "We want roads," the banners read. "Stop stepping over the poor." The protest had been planned for weeks. Flyers distributed at night. Group chats buzzing with anger. The potholes in Zone 7 had become craters, the kind that swallowed wheels and hope in equal measure. A motorbike accident 2 weeks prior had left a schoolgirl in a coma. The people had had enough. But when the protesters turned the final corner toward City Hall, they stopped. They were met not by barricades or riot police, but by men and women in orange vests kneeling in the gutters. A young man at the front of the march blinked in confusion. "That's the transport minister," he muttered, pointing. "Isn't it?" The crowd squinted through the midday haze. There was no mistaking it. High-ranking officials were on their knees, pulling weeds from drains, lifting trash with gloved hands. Not just one or two for show, but dozens. One woman with a megaphone lowered it slowly. She recognized another figure crouched beside a pile of concrete rubble. "That's the Minister of Infrastructure," she said, stunned. No cameras flashed, no podium stood waiting. There was no sound but the rustle of garbage bags and the scrape of tools against cement. A few children from nearby homes began passing water to the workers. And there among them was the Prime Minister himself, hauling a broken sewer cover onto a cart with 2 elderly residents cheering beside him. The protesters didn't know what to do. A man near the middle of the crowd raised his sign higher, defiant. "It's too late," he yelled. "You can't fix this with one broom." But his voice lacked its earlier heat. The woman next to him lowered her sign slowly. "Look," she whispered, "they're sweating." One by one the signs began to drop. Not in surrender, but in recognition. Some placed theirs on the curb, others simply let go. The crowd that had come to shout found themselves watching in silence. Then someone moved. A mother who had lost her son to a car accident on a flooded road stepped forward. She approached a young deputy minister who was wiping his brow with a rag covered in grime. "You know," she said softly, "this drain has been blocked since my boy was alive." The minister looked up. "Then let's clear it for him." She picked up a shovel without another word. What followed next was something the city had never seen. The protest line dissolved, but the people didn't leave. Instead, they began to join in. Teachers pulled rakes from a wheelbarrow. Motorbike riders parked on sidewalks and grabbed gloves. Youths who had come to chant began pushing carts of collected debris. A drummer who had planned to lead chants began to beat a different rhythm, steadier, lighter. Two women who had practiced protest songs began to hum an old lullaby instead. From somewhere down the block, a brass band emerged, originally hired to draw attention to the march. Now their trumpets filled the air with soft, proud notes. The protest had become a parade not of celebration, but of purpose. Down the boulevard, people lined the sidewalks, watching in awe. Elders clapped from their porches. Children ran ahead of the carts, laughing and shouting, "Come help! The country is moving." Street vendors gave out fruit and water without charging. Store owners stepped out to sweep their own entrances, ashamed they hadn't done it sooner. A reporter tried to interview one of the original protest organizers. She was now knee-deep in a muddy pit pulling out old tires with two teenage boys. "Why aren't you chanting anymore?" the reporter asked. She wiped her face and pointed to the drain. "Because this is louder." By the time the group reached the mayor's office, the sun was tilting west. The street once filled with signs of rage was now cleaner than it had been in years. And the crowd, though tired and muddy, glowed with something new. Not satisfaction, not victory, but unity. Mayor Jibril came out of the building holding a broom. When he saw the crowd approaching, he paused. Then he raised the broom high above his head. They answered with cheers, not of conquest, but of commitment. A boy from the crowd broke away and handed the mayor a sign from earlier. It read, "We want roads." The mayor took it, flipped it over, and wrote in thick black marker, "We walk together." The crowd clapped. Then someone began to sing. It wasn't a hymn or a chant, just a soft melody that others quickly picked up. A song about streets and storms, about hands and healing. Soon, the whole avenue echoed with it. Brooms tapped the rhythm. Feet stomped softly in time. By nightfall, the streetlights flickered on over a city that had witnessed something rare. A protest without tear gas. A movement without ego. And in the place where anger had marched, a new kind of power now walked. It didn't shout. It swept. It sang. It stayed. The cleaners saw him from a block away. His suit was charcoal gray, crisp as paper. His shoes glistened Italian leather, handcrafted the kind that never touched dust. The guards at Banque Nationale tried to stop him from walking across the cleanup zone in Sector 2, but he waved them off. "I'm not here for protection," he said. "I'm here for the street." The workers stared. Some paused mid-sweep. One whispered, Isn't that Alain Douamba? Another replied, No one like him comes here, unless there's a camera. But there were no reporters, no entourage, just the CEO of the largest private bank in Burkina Faso, walking toward the people with something unusual in his hands, a plastic trash bin. He placed it gently beside a mound of debris near the market stalls. Then he rolled up his sleeves, bent down, and started collecting garbage with bare hands. Silence blanketed the street. A teenage vendor leaned toward her mother. Is he serious? The mother nodded slowly. That man signs checks worth more than this whole block. Alain didn't speak. He worked quietly, lifting pieces of plastic rusted cans, torn fabric bits of paper, mottled with rain. The workers watched, still unsure. Then one of them, a man in his 60s with faded overalls and missing teeth, walked over and handed him a pair of gloves. Your hands aren't made for this, the old man said. Alain took the gloves. They should have been. 10 minutes later, they were working side by side. The banker and the sweeper. The man who approved loans for skyscrapers and the man who cleaned their sidewalks. As more people recognized him, a crowd formed. Some took pictures, others simply stared. But Alain never looked up. His eyes stayed on the ground, his motions deliberate. At one point, he stood, wiped sweat from his brow, and turned to address the crowd. The economy, he said, his voice low but steady, is built on clean streets, on order, on dignity, and I will not manage money with dirty hands while expecting you to clean up after me. The silence that followed was heavy. Then a slow clap began, just one man at first, then a woman, then another, and soon the block was alive with applause. An hour later, a sleek silver car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a woman in a cream blouse and gold earrings. Her heels clicked against the pavement until she reached the pile where Alain stood, now smudged with dirt and sweat. She kissed him gently on the cheek, pulled a pair of gloves from her purse, and turned to the sanitation team. Where do you need me? She asked. The workers blinked. One of them stammered, Ma'am, you don't need to. I married this man, she interrupted with a grin. Not just the suit. They handed her a broom. She began sweeping beside a group of women who quickly welcomed her with nods and a few jokes. Within minutes, she was laughing with them, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The banker's wife, once featured in fashion magazines, was now sweeping leaves into a pile while humming an old folk song from her childhood. A photographer from a local newspaper arrived. He raised his camera, trying to catch the perfect shot. But Alain turned to him and said, If your picture doesn't include the man who gave me gloves, don't take it. The photographer lowered the lens and joined the cleanup. By late afternoon, the pile of trash was gone, replaced by freshly raked earth and the scent of soap from a bucket of water used to rinse the gutter. Alain removed his gloves and handed them back to the elder worker. Keep them, the man said. You wore them better than most. No, Alain replied. I wore them exactly the same. That evening, the boardroom at Banque Nationale stood empty. Alain had cancelled the meeting. Instead, he sat with his wife and a group of workers at a roadside stall, drinking millet porridge from tin cups. A woman leaned over and whispered, We thought you people didn't even see us. Alain replied, We were trained not to. Another man added, Then why now? Alain looked around at the hands holding brooms and buckets, at the dirt-stained shirts, at the quiet smiles. Because the president bent first, he said. And when the highest bends, no one stands too tall to follow. That week, Alain issued a statement to the national press, not about quarterly earnings, but about civic responsibility. He pledged that every branch of the bank would partner with local cleanup efforts, not with donations, but with labor. Every senior executive would work 1 shift a month in public service, gloves included. The policy was met with confusion at first, then respect, then imitation. Other firms followed suit. CEOs posted pictures of themselves holding trash bags. Lawyers picked up litter outside courthouses. Even stockbrokers were seen pushing carts through market alleys, nodding humbly at the women who had swept there for decades. In the lobby of Banque Nationale, the security guard placed a new object beside the floral arrangement, a plain, battered trash bin with a laminated sign taped to the lid. It read, "Carried by the hands that changed ours." And for the first time in years, clients entering the building didn't look up at the chandeliers. They looked down, where it all started, where the dirt had finally taught dignity. They gathered under a wide, white canopy in the capital's central square, unsure whether to sit or stand. Some had never stepped foot in this part of the city. Others came in their faded green uniforms, gloves folded neatly in their pockets, brooms leaned against their knees. Sanitation workers from every province, some fresh-faced, others gray-haired and stooped, sat shoulder to shoulder. There were no gold chains, no ceremonial trumpets, no polished marble beneath their feet. But the air buzzed with something heavier than ceremony. It buzzed with justice. President Traoré took the podium dressed simply. No medals, no military sash, just the same boots and vest he'd worn on the cleanup routes. His voice was steady but warm as he spoke. For too long, he said, we've measured worth by what glitters, by height, by rank, by titles printed in ink. But today we honor those whose hands built this republic with neither spotlight nor applause. Behind him, government officials stood in rows, each holding a folded garment. They were jackets, deep green, stitched with golden stripes across the shoulder and chest. On the sleeve, embroidered in gold thread, were the words, "National Honor for Civic Service." When the announcer called her name, Safiatou Douamba hesitated. She was 64, a widow, and had swept the streets of Ouagadougou since before the Civil War. Her hands trembled as she rose. She had seen presidents come and go, each promising change. She had attended none of their events. But today was different. She stepped onto the stage, her worn sandals slapping the wood. As the president helped her into the coat, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the weight of the fabric, it was the weight of finally being seen. The golden stripe across her chest shimmered under the afternoon sun. "This," she whispered, clutching the collar, "is the first uniform I've worn that didn't make me invisible." A collective hush fell over the crowd. Then a ripple of applause. Then a wave. More names were called. More workers stood, eyes wide, hands over mouths. Some wept openly, some saluted in half-joking pride. A man who had worked nights for 20 years leaned against his cane as his grandson took photos. "I told you I was somebody," he said. By the time the last coat was given, the plaza had transformed. Rows of green with gold shimmered like a new flag rising from the earth. Some jackets were too big, others snug, but each one carried a dignity far beyond its threads. The Minister of Culture stepped forward next, holding a leather-bound document. "We are establishing a national archive," she said, "to record the names, roots, and stories of every sanitation worker in this country. From now on, your labor will live in history, not just memory." The applause was thunderous. At the side of the stage, a group of children sang a song composed just for the occasion. It was simple repeating the names of local sanitation heroes between verses. One boy, no older than 8, sang the name of his mother, who stood crying in the front row. She raised her coat sleeve to hide her face, but her eyes never left the stage. When the ceremony ended, no one rushed to leave. Workers stood in clusters comparing jackets, laughing, retelling the worst gutters they'd ever cleaned. Some offered to trade sizes, others folded theirs carefully back into the clear plastic bags they'd been handed. Traoré stayed behind, shaking hands one by one. He paused to listen to stories. One man said he'd been turned down for a bank loan because of his job title. Now he smiled, tapping the golden stripe, "They can't say I don't contribute." Nearby, a group of young volunteers from the National University were taking notes, planning a documentary on the workers. They moved gently, asking permission before taking each photo. They wanted to get it right. At sunset, a group of sanitation workers from the northern region stood together, arms draped over each other's shoulders. They posed for a picture in front of the fountain jackets, glowing green and gold against the amber sky. One of them turned to the others and said, "You know, we used to be called ghosts." Another replied, "Now we're in the light." That night across the country, radios replayed excerpts from the ceremony. Children pointed out workers they knew in photos. Local tailors began stitching imitation jackets out of pride. And in homes where uniforms had once been hidden out of shame, they were now hung by the door like medals. In a village near Koudougou, an elderly man walked to the front of his compound and tapped on his neighbor's gate. "What is it?" the neighbor asked. "I want you to see something," the man said, holding up his jacket. The neighbor nodded slowly, voice tight with emotion. "You've waited your whole life for that." The old man smiled. "No. I waited for my country to see it too. And in that moment, under the quiet stars of a freshly cleaned street, honor wore no crown, just gloves, boots, and a green coat lined in gold." It happened on a Thursday morning, just as the national broadcaster prepared to go live for another day of coverage. The camera crew was already in place at a cleanup site in Sector 10, adjusting their lenses to frame President Traoré, helping students clear a dried-out canal. Behind him stood a cluster of ministers, city workers, and local volunteers ready to begin. The director called for a sound check. The countdown began. But before the red light blinked on, Traoré raised his hand. "No broadcast today," he said quietly. The sound technician looked up in confusion. "Sir, we're scheduled to air at 9. Traoré stepped toward the camera, looked directly into the lens, then turned to the press team behind it. "Turn them off." All of them. A murmur rippled through the crew. One journalist protested, "But the people want to see this. They already do." Traoré replied, "Let them see it with their hearts, not through our lens." And with that, the cameras went dark. The decision stunned reporters, especially those from foreign networks who had come to document what they thought was a publicity campaign. They didn't understand why a leader would turn off the stage just when the world had started to watch. But for Traoré, that was the very reason. He didn't want to perform. He wanted the work to breathe without the spotlight. Across the city, media vans packed up, boom mics lowered. Photographers tucked their lenses away. The official live stream on state TV faded to black. In its place, a simple message appeared. This story now belongs to the people. At first, some districts hesitated. Without cameras, there was no pressure, no accountability, no proof. But within hours, something unexpected began to unfold. A mother in the neighborhood of Campai finished hanging laundry and looked out across the dusty lot beside her home. Her children had been playing there all week, stepping over broken bottles and old food wrappers. No camera was coming. No minister would arrive. But she picked up a broom anyway. Her daughter followed. Then her neighbor. Then 2 boys with sticks and a wheelbarrow. By midday, 5 families were working side by side. Someone played music from a phone speaker. Someone else brought water. They weren't filmed, but they were seen. The same thing happened in Dédougou, where market vendors spontaneously swept their stalls without direction. In Ziniare, a retired teacher returned to her old school and cleared weeds from the playground. In Gaoua, a group of teenagers posted a sign on their neighborhood wall. "This street is ours. We clean it ourselves." People began sharing phone footage not from media professionals, but from children, shopkeepers, street hawkers. The videos were shaky, blurry, but full of movement, full of truth. In one clip, a group of grandmothers in bright head wraps joked as they cleared trash from a sidewalk. "We clean faster without an audience," one laughed. In another video, 2 boys no older than 12 lifted a rusty bicycle frame from a drainage canal while arguing about who had better shoes. Neither had any on. No stage, no script, just country. In Ouahigouya, a group of sanitation workers held a quiet ceremony. They placed their new green jackets with golden stripes on plastic chairs, then stood behind them facing the rising sun. This, said one of them, is for those who never got to wear it, the ones who died without being thanked. A passerby recorded it and uploaded the video. Within hours, it reached thousands. The media, stunned, at first tried to adjust. Without access to official events, they turned to the people. They interviewed vendors, mechanics, bus drivers. One foreign correspondent confessed, "This is the first time I've covered a national movement where the president left the frame and the story only got stronger." By Sunday, something extraordinary had happened. The cleanup campaign was no longer a government operation. It had slipped from the hands of officials and settled gently into the calloused palms of its citizens. It lived in side streets, alleyways, courtyards, in the laughter between neighbors, in the quiet dignity of an elder bending over a gutter, in the joy of a child planting flowers where old tires used to rot. Traoré walked through a small town in silence, wearing a plain shirt and cap. No one noticed him at first. Then a boy saw his face and shouted, "He's here!" But Traoré raised a finger to his lips. The boy smiled and said nothing more. They worked side by side, the boy and the president pulling weeds from a cracked sidewalk. That evening at the presidential compound, Traoré met with his advisors. No press release, one asked. He shook his head. "The story doesn't need us to speak anymore. It's speaking on every street." Someone handed him a phone. A new video had just gone viral. In it, a little girl was helping her grandfather sweep their compound. He stopped to rest, and she looked into the camera and said, "We don't need cameras. We have each other." Traoré watched it twice, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "that's the future I've been trying to film all along. It was the wind that signaled the change first. Not loud or sudden, but subtle. It swept across the city in the early morning, curling through alleyways and schoolyards, no longer carrying the dry bite of dust and decay. Instead, it brought the smell of something rare, something almost forgotten. The scent of wet soil, of turned earth, of beginnings. In Sector 4, a boy named Idrissa walked barefoot across a field that used to be a dumping ground. He paused beneath a small sapling, its leaves trembling gently in the breeze. The tree had only been in the ground a week, but it stood proud, tied to a wooden stake, surrounded by stones arranged like a crown. His teacher knelt beside another hole, guiding students as they lowered a young neem into the dirt. Idrissa stepped closer and whispered, "Miss, my street smells like hope." She looked up, startled, then smiled. "That's what trees do, Idrissa. They teach the air how to breathe again." Across the city, children gathered in clusters, clutching seedlings in their hands. In schools, churches, mosques, even abandoned lots, tiny forests were sprouting. No one had ordered it. No ministry had mandated it. The people had simply decided that clean wasn't enough. They wanted green. In the neighborhood of Samandain, a woman named Jamila had cleared the vacant lot beside her home. Where goats once wandered through garbage, she now built rows of small garden beds. She planted tomatoes, peppers, and okra. Her neighbors helped bring in compost scraps of wood for fencing, even an old bench they fixed up together. "We were waiting for someone else to fix it," she said one afternoon. But then we remembered we are someone. Nearby, a group of men who once spent their afternoons playing dominoes under a broken roof now spent their mornings painting walls and repairing broken sidewalks. When asked what changed, one of them simply replied, "The wind turned, so we followed." The phrase spread. In Bobo Dioulasso, a team of university students installed vertical gardens in the narrow alleys behind their dorms. They used recycled bottles, old tires, broken crates. They laughed as they worked, telling stories of how they used to avoid these alleys. Now, one girl said, brushing her hands off on her jeans, "They're places we come to grow." In Dedougou, a blind elder named Yakuba insisted on planting his own tree in front of the village health clinic. With help from his grandson, he dug slowly, feeling the roots with his fingers. When the boy tried to guide his hands too quickly, Yakuba stopped him. "Let me find it myself," he said. "The tree will remember the shape of my touch." Back in Ouagadougou, President Traoré walked through a school courtyard where students had planted 20 trees in 2 days. He paused as a girl offered him a sapling. "It's a baobab," she said proudly. "We named it after the first street sweeper who cleaned our school gate." Traoré took the seedling carefully. "What was her name? Madame Fati." He nodded. "Then may this tree stand as long as her memory." He knelt and helped the girl place the roots into the hole, gently pressing the soil around it. Children clapped. One began singing quietly, and others joined until the courtyard was filled with soft melody and the rustling of new leaves. On the edge of the capital, an old man stood outside his home, watching as teenagers shoveled compost into a roadside planter. He had watched the same road for decades, watched it flood a road, collect trash. Now he watched it bloom. He shook his head and said to no one in particular, "For years, the wind only carried dust. Now it carries promises." Journalists returned this time, not for speeches or images of ministers. They came to capture what couldn't be staged. A grandmother teaching her grandson how to water seedlings before the sun got too hot. A school principal using chalk to label each tree with a student's name. A mechanic painting used tires and turning them into flower beds. And through it all, the wind moved, lifting scent, lifting spirit. A documentary crew caught footage of a boy planting a tree on the spot where his uncle once sold bread from a rusted cart. The boy pressed his fingers deep into the soil and said, "He worked here his whole life. I want something to grow here now." In the Ministry of Environment, data analysts began tracking tree plantings by region, but the numbers couldn't keep up. Every hour, more trees went into the ground than they could record. One evening, as the sky turned orange and the city quieted, Traoré stood alone in a garden planted on the roof of an old government building. He looked down at the lights of the city, the faint green patches breaking through the concrete like veins. He took a deep breath. Not the smell of exhaust, not rot, but the scent of something clean, living, human. He closed his eyes. Somewhere a drumbeat echoed in the distance. A child laughed. A shovel scraped earth. And the wind, now full of life, passed gently through the open windows of the city, reminding everyone that what had started as a cleanup was now something far greater. It was rebirth. The ink had barely dried on the morning paper when the courtyard of the National Assembly began to fill. No banners, no protests, no political chants, just quiet anticipation. Women in green jackets with golden stripes took their seats beside university students with compost under their nails. Former street kids stood beside engineers. Sanitation workers sat front row. They had earned that seat. Inside the chamber, President Traoré stood behind a simple wooden table. No gilded podium, no military medals, just a pen, a document, and a quiet fire in his chest. He looked out at the room, ministers, journalists, citizens, and then at the cameras which he had allowed to return for this moment. Because this moment was not about him. It was about the people finally seeing themselves written into law. He began with no preamble. For too long, he said, we believed dignity was given from above, that if we were clean enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, we might one day be seen. But what this movement showed us is that dignity rises from the ground up, and today we protect it. He held up the document. The Urban Environmental Dignity Act. The name had been debated for weeks. Some had pushed for something more technical. Others wanted something flashier. Traoré had insisted on these words because they belonged to the streets, not the suits. He read the heart of the bill aloud. Beginning this fiscal year, every urban municipality in Burkina Faso shall allocate a minimum of 10% of its annual budget to public sanitation, citizen-led environmental restoration, and community beautification. These funds shall not be contracted to private entities, but managed by local councils made up of residents, workers, and educators. Every citizen shall have the right to a clean, safe, and dignified environment. The room didn't erupt in applause. It exhaled. In the gallery, Maimuna Sankara, still wearing her green coat from the National Honor Ceremony, closed her eyes. She had swept those same streets when no one knew her name. Today, her labor had written a law. A minister whispered to a colleague, "We just made the broom sacred." In the back, Jibril, the young mayor, nodded slowly. He had already prepared a plan to restructure his city's sanitation budget. He'd waited years to do it. Now he had the authority to match the will. After the signing, the golden seal of the presidency was pressed onto the document. Traoré didn't pose with it. He handed it directly to the Minister of Local Governance and said, "Deliver this to the people, not the press." Outside, word spread quickly. In marketplaces, cheers rang out. On social media, youth leaders began translating the bill into local languages. In classrooms, teachers asked students to write essays about what they'd do with the 10%. One girl wrote, "I will paint the walls where fear used to live." By evening, city councils held emergency meetings. The law required swift action audits of existing sanitation contracts, establishment of citizen committees, immediate redirection of funds. It was ambitious, it was disruptive, and it was happening. In Koudougou, a group of women formed a cooperative to design public benches using recycled materials. In Banfora, teenagers created murals along alleyways cleared during the campaign, turning old walls into declarations of pride. In Kaya, sanitation workers elected their own representatives to the local beautification committee. They had names now, budgets, voices. Some resisted. A few mayors grumbled about losing control. One businessman warned of unprofessional hands handling infrastructure. But the people responded before Traoré had to. A youth collective released a statement, "We cleaned without funding. We restored without permission. Now, we have both." At the University of Ouagadougou, economics professors held debates on the implications of non-corporate municipal governance. One student argued, this isn't anti-growth, it's growth rooted in ownership. Another added, we're not against business, we're against being sold our own dignity. Traoré didn't tour television studios. He didn't give interviews. He returned to the same neighborhood where the first broom had touched the ground. A small alley where children once played beside rotting piles. Now it was lined with painted tires filled with flowers. A mural of a sanitation worker smiling covered one wall. He stood quietly watching as a boy watered a tree that bore a handmade sign planted by the hands of many. A local elder approached him and said, "This time you didn't give a gift. You gave a tool." Traoré nodded. And now it's theirs to use. Across the country, budget lines began to change. Mayors began to listen before they spent. And citizens long treated as passive observers stepped into roles of stewards, shapers, decision-makers. The Urban Environmental Dignity Act wasn't just legislation. It was a mirror. One that finally reflected the true face of the Republic. Not marble floors or air-conditioned halls, but soil-stained gloves, recycled wood, laughter in alleys, flowers blooming where trash once ruled. And above it all, the wind carried something new, faith in the law, not as command, but as echo. Echo of hands that swept, of feet that marched, of voices that rose not to be heard, but to be followed. The school auditorium was full. Parents leaned forward in their seats. Teachers stood along the walls, and the younger students in the back whispered excitedly as the principal tapped the microphone. On the stage stood a girl in a simple white dress, holding a folded paper in her hand. Behind her, projected on the wall, was a photo taken 5 years ago. A small girl in oversized gloves, gripping the edge of a black trash bag. Beside her knelt President Traoré, broom in hand, his eyes focused on the ground they were cleaning together. The image had been printed in newspapers across the country, but today it belonged to her. The room quieted as Aisha stepped forward. She looked taller now, her hair pulled into a tight braid. Her voice calm but clear as she began to speak. "I was 9 years old when that photo was taken," she said, pointing behind her without turning. "I didn't go there to make history. I went because my mother was tired, and because I wanted the road to my school to stop smelling like something the world had thrown away." The audience sat still listening. I remember that day. I remember dropping my school bag. I remember people staring. I remember how heavy the trash bag felt in my hands. I remember the president didn't ask me why I was there. He just handed me gloves. Like I belonged. She paused, unfolded the paper slowly. At the time, I didn't have the words. But now, 5 years later, I do. We didn't just clean the streets. We cleared a path for ourselves. A soft wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. "My name is Aisha Douamba. My mother is a sanitation worker. She raised me alone. She taught me that dignity isn't something someone gives you, it's something you carry like a broom, like a trash bag, like truth." She glanced around the room. Her eyes landed on her mother seated in the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were already wet. I stand here today not because I was chosen, but because I chose to keep going. After that day, I kept cleaning, not because I had to, but because it reminded me that we're not helpless. And now, thanks to a law this country just passed, my school is clean every day. We planted 10 trees around the courtyard. Our science lab runs on solar panels. And next year I'll apply to study environmental engineering. A ripple of applause broke out, but died quickly at her raised hand. But before that, I want to say this, she continued. There was a time when children like me were told to stay quiet, to stay out of sight, to survive. But now we plant, now we paint, now we speak. She looked back at the photo. I was just a girl with a trash bag, but that girl helped start something, and I've learned that the smallest acts, when done with love and with others, can outlast anything, even concrete. She stepped back as applause swelled, not polite or obligatory, but full and rising. Teachers clapped with pride. Students stood on tiptoe to see her better. Her mother stood too, and everyone followed. The ovation rolled through the room like music long after Aisha left the stage. Outside the courtyard, where students had once avoided gathering, now brimmed with life. Murals covered the old brick walls. Raised garden beds lined the perimeter, sprouting vegetables and flowers. A bench built from recycled wood bore an inscription carved by Aisha's class, "Clean hands, clear future." Traoré had seen the speech remotely. A video had been uploaded just an hour after it ended, already circulating across the country. In his office, he watched quietly. At the final line, "We cleaned our streets and cleared a path for ourselves," he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the capital that had changed more in 5 years than in 5 decades. That night, Aisha and her mother sat on their rooftop under the stars. A gentle wind stirred the sheets on the clothesline. "You made me proud today," her mother said softly. "I was just telling the truth," Aisha replied. Her mother reached over, took her hand. "Then never stop." From below, laughter rose from the courtyard. Students were still out watering the gardens, picking up wrappers, chatting as they worked. Aisha looked down and smiled. "They're still sweeping." "They will for a long time," her mother said, "because you reminded them why." The photo of Aisha and the president now hung in the school hallway, framed not in gold, but in wood carved by local students. And beside it, a quote etched in stone. "It only takes one girl with a bag to start a nation's cleansing." And in the quiet that followed, somewhere across the city, another child reached for a broom, uncoached, unwatched, and began again. In the weeks after the campaign settled into rhythm, something curious began to appear across Burkina Faso. First, it was a bench made of old tires and painted wood outside a primary school in Tenkodogo. Then a small footbridge in Kaya fashioned from rusted sheet metal once pulled from a drainage canal. In Bobo Dioulasso, flower pots made from plastic buckets lined the walkways of a hospital. What had once been discarded, ignored, buried, or swept aside was now transformed into something useful, even beautiful. It wasn't a government order. It wasn't part of any policy memo or international grant. It was a choice made by the people themselves. They had spent months collecting, sorting, and lifting waste from the very soil they walked on. And now they refused to throw it away again. Instead, they reimagined it. In Ouagadougou, the Central Park underwent a quiet renovation. Local volunteers used recovered materials to build a shaded seating area. They layered bricks with cement made from crushed tiles and melted plastic. Instead of marble plaques, children painted colorful signs that read, "Rest here. Citizen, and this place belongs to your hands." A wall on the west end of the park became the most visited spot in the city. Once covered in political graffiti, it was now coated in soft yellow paint. In the center, in letters bold but hand-drawn, it read, "Nothing is trash when the people are treasured." People came to take photos beside it. Not just tourists, but sanitation workers, students, nurses, mechanics. A woman who once begged outside the central market was photographed standing proudly next to the mural, holding her broom like a staff. In smaller towns, workshops sprung up. Elders taught youth how to turn metal scraps into bike racks. Mothers who had once sold charcoal began weaving baskets from discarded plastic strips. A retired engineer in Kudugu held free weekend classes in a garage, showing neighborhood boys how to make water filters using broken bottles and sand. If the West can recycle ideas, he told them, so can we. In Zorgo, a new playground emerged from what used to be an illegal dumping site. The swings were built from cleaned rubber belts and salvaged chains. The slide, once part of an abandoned truck ramp, had been scrubbed until it gleamed. Children lined up for their turn while their parents watched from benches painted by local artists. One parent said quietly, "We used to cross the street to avoid this place. Now our children run toward it." At a town hall meeting in Dori, a woman named Fatimata stood and presented a model of a community library built entirely from campaign waste. She had designed it herself: walls from stacked plastic containers, roof tiles from metal sheets, bookshelves made of pallet wood. The room fell silent as she spoke. We used to measure ourselves by what we lacked. Now we measure by what we build. And what we've learned is that nothing given by the people is ever garbage. In the Ministry of Education, the curriculum was updated to include lessons on local reuse innovation. Textbooks now showed photos of gardens planted in cement sacks of bus stops, built from swept debris of classrooms, shaded by awnings sewn from old uniforms. A competition was launched, the National Reuse Challenge. Villages and neighborhoods competed to create the most beautiful, most functional public space using only recycled material from the cleanup campaign. Prizes were modest books, supplies, toolkits, but the true reward was pride. Communities glowed with their creations: a fountain from old barrels, a statue made entirely of rusted wrenches, a chess table where the pawns were bottle caps, and the king's soda cans. During the award ceremony in Ouagadougou, President Traoré walked through the exhibition. He stopped at a small sculpture just 3 feet tall. It was a girl made from twisted metal rods holding a trash bag, her face molded from bottle shards. On her chest was the word Aicha. A man approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "My daughter made this," he said. Traoré looked at him. "She sees clearly." The man nodded. She said she wanted to show what happens when a child refuses to drop the weight of her country. Outside the exhibition, crowds gathered around another mural. This one had no name attached, no artist signature. It simply showed dozens of hands, big, small, dark, pale, passing bricks from one side of a wall to another. Above them, a sentence: "If you hold it with care, even waste becomes worth." And the people did hold it with care. Not just the material, but each other. Markets became cleaner, not because police enforced it, but because vendors protected the space. Public restrooms were painted, scrubbed, respected. Water points were surrounded by plants instead of mud. Homes no longer dumped garbage into the roads. Children reminded adults to sort waste. Grandmothers taught composting like they once taught proverbs. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about transformation. Deep, irreversible citizen-led. A country that had once been called underdeveloped was now called inventive. Communities once shamed were now imitated. Journalists from abroad came to ask, "How did you do it?" And the people answered, "We stopped waiting to be saved. And we started building from what was broken." The nation hadn't just recycled plastic. It had recycled despair into dignity, scarcity into invention, waste into worth. And the wind that carried dust before now carried stories of what happens when hands that sweep are also trusted to shape, of a country that found gold not underground, but in its own streets. It began in silence, not the kind born of fear or hesitation, but of reverence. In every corner of Burkina Faso, from the sun-baked edges of Saaba to the quiet courtyards of Banfora, people knelt. Not to pray, not to beg, not to protest, but to tend, to touch the soil that had shaped them. Some planted their hands deep in earth. Others swept the last of the dry leaves into small piles. A few simply wept, overwhelmed by the sight of what had become of their streets, their homes, their country. A woman knelt outside her storefront, scrubbing the last stain from the wall where trash had once been dumped. A boy in clean sandals crouched beside a tree he had planted weeks earlier, now blooming with new green. Beside him, an elder man laid bricks in a garden path with fingers as steady as they had been 50 years ago when he helped build the first water well in his village. In a neighborhood once known for its decay, children painted stones to line a walking trail. Each stone bore a single word: respect, soil, tomorrow, together. In the capital sanitation, workers knelt in front of the new National Civic Garden, not to clean, but to rest. The garden had been built from reclaimed land, using nothing but recycled materials and donated labor. Flowers bloomed in rows beside vegetable beds. Trees shaded benches carved from storm-felled trunks. It smelled like life, like effort, like home. On a hill above the city, President Traoré stood with no microphone, no script, no press. He wore the same green vest as the others, his knees dirty from hours spent planting in the fields that morning. Around him stood former ministers, now gardeners, former skeptics, now stewards. He looked down at the city that had once knelt in shame. Now it knelt in love. A camera crew once forbidden had been granted permission for one final shot. They began low eye level with the hands in the dirt. Wrinkled hands, small hands, blistered hands, hands braiding vines along a fence, hands sweeping the last crumbs of waste into a bin, hands gripping watering cans, hands held together in prayer, not for a miracle, but in gratitude that the miracle had already begun. The lens panned up, past the families in the schoolyard painting walls with images of brooms and trees, past the bankers and drivers pulling weeds side by side, past the rows of solar lights now lining the avenues, past rooftops covered in green where urban farms thrived in what used to be concrete scars. The camera rose, and with it the skyline. And it revealed a blooming city. Not perfect, not finished, but unmistakably reborn. Voiceover. They didn't rise through war. They rose through work, through dignity, through dust turned into dreams. And across the country, As the sun sank behind hills now green again, a breeze carried the scent of jasmine and compost and rain. People looked at their calloused hands, at the places they once passed in silence, and now passed in pride. And no one needed to say it aloud. They had knelt to rise, and they were standing.